Thank you very much, David. And can I just say, as you have to, what a great pleasure it is to be here, to be back in this city which I remember having trams running along from Courtney Place. So it brings back great feelings of nostalgia. The rain that came down earlier reminds me of London. Everything is make me feel entirely at home. But I've got a really serious message this morning, which is we've got to talk about health. The developed world has got a real problem. We've been hugely successful in building up healthcare systems and improving the health of our nations. But we've reached crisis point. The rate of increase in our investment in our healthcare is outstripping the rate of growth of GDP in every developed country, without exception. It's true of New Zealand and it's true of the UK, it's true around the world. And yet, the amount that we invest in healthcare varies enormously. It varies in most of the developed world from between 8 to 12% of GDP. And if I put that into precise figures per capita, because there are different ways of measuring this, New Zealand is spending around $3,000 per capita a year on healthcare. For the UK, it's $3,500. For France, it's $4,000. For Germany, it's $4,200. And for the US, it's $8,000. $8,000 per citizen, equating now to over 18% of GDP in the US. If you project the figures forward, by the way, they intersect to the point at which the US spends more on healthcare than it produces in GDP. And the gap is closing. It's completely impossible, completely unsustainable in a nation that has 40 million people uninsured and which has the Obama healthcare package currently held up in the Supreme Court and may yet even be struck down by the judges in the Supreme Court. A country has a moral and political and economic imperative to take care of the health of its citizens. You know, the curious thing is that if you look at the global evidence, there are 3 major indices which track health outcomes in all developed countries, including a very authoritative one from the OECD called Health at a Glance. There's no obvious correlation, actually, between the level of a nation's investment and the outcomes in terms of health in that nation. There are different variables, there are different survival rates for cancer, for cardiovascular disease, and other conditions which are listed. But the correlation, or lack of correlation, causes us to ask why it is that healthcare costs are going up, and what is it that we can do about them? Well, item 1, healthcare costs are going up because of the costs of pharmaceuticals. The pharmaceutical industry is investing something like 80% of its revenues in R&D, but the pipeline's running dry. There is a huge risk now in taking a new medicine to market. At least $1 billion will be spent on any new product coming out of the pharmaceutical industry. Intellectual property rights are running out on what's already in the pipeline. Generics are flooding the market, and the investment that's needed by the pharmaceutical industry dominates anything which is reasonably possible. Secondly, we're seeing much greater improvements in outcomes. Curiously, and this sounds perverse, but look at the medical interventions of the 21st century compared to those of the 19th and 20th century. Heart attacks. The incidence of cardiovascular disease through cardiac infarction is greatly reduced. Reduction in the levels of smoking are a major contributor, but also early intervention, proper management of blood pressure, the use of stents, or even undertaking quadruple heart bypasses and getting the patient out of the hospital within 5 days. Completely unimaginable 20 years ago. So people are no longer dying of sudden acute incidents of disease to the extent that they were. Increasingly, they're dying with disease rather than of disease. And we can see this also in relation to cancer. We can see the use of new products in orthopedics, for example, entire hip replacements and knee joints and joint replacements. We're now seeing modern technology producing new organs for the body. We had a recent operation at Great Ormond Street by UCL surgeons which involved the growing of a new trachea using nanotechnology and implanting it in an 11-year-old child who had never had a proper air passage and was now able to breathe normally for the first time. Dramatic new technology, but immensely expensive. There are, of course, other improvements in healthcare which have come about as a consequence of improvements in the standard of living, reduction in the mere stress of survival. I have colleagues who have mapped the environmental determinants of health and can tell you how it is that inequalities in society drive ill health, and how a society that is more at ease with itself is a society where health improves. Most dramatically, the failure of the USSR brought down average longevity in the USSR dramatically. Not through increased consumption of alcohol or vodka, which is a variant of alcohol, as will be well known here, but also simply that people had lost the certainty of an existence that the old communist regime gave. So we're doing a number of things that allow us to start to comprehend that life expectancy is growing and will continue to grow. It's now about 80 years old, life expectancy at birth, but the good news, if you like it, is that it's growing by 5 hours a day. So while you've been sitting here already this morning, your life expectancy has gone up by a few hours, this is simply by mapping, actually, life expectancy going up year on year on year. I mean, the grisly reality is, I mean, could you imagine living to over 100? Because that's what the prospect is that we now hold out to our children. But what's life going to be like under those conditions? We need to start to project forward what will happen. The first problem is that the more of us who live longer, the fewer of us there are to support us. The tax base will diminish, and the volume of expenditure available to support an older population no longer so physically or intellectually active will start to decline. Now, it's not just the developing world, or the developed world, I should say. Look at China. Policy for the past 2 decades now finds itself in a position where the demographic Christmas tree is truncated at the base. And there is a bulge coming through the system of people, dare I say it, of our age. I know that's a big generalization looking around the room today, but you know, up there, and fewer people down here. So one child will be expected to support economically a family of 3 or 4 parents, grandparents, and beyond. And so the China demographic looks completely different from the India demographic, where there has not been a single child policy, if anything the reverse. And the Indian economy in 20 years' time will still be introducing 2 million people a year to the workplace, while the China economy will be taking them out. So around the world, we know we can't afford to go on as we are. And yet, investment in healthcare is going to be essential. We're going to do wonderful things. We're going into an era of stratified medicine, leading into personalized medicine, an era in which we can understand much better the genetic response of medicines, of medication, in which instead of now just giving one drug to everybody suffering from a particular form of cancer, we can model the drug against their genetic construct, and we can understand which will work with this person better than with this person, leading ultimately to a model of much more personalized medicine. But in terms of investment, we're a long way behind it. We will have many more people living with disease rather than dying from it. But you know, we're also working against ourselves because of the growing incidence of lifestyle disease. I mentioned smoking before, and smoking has been going down in almost all nations, although there are some where it's rapidly rising. But it's still 20% in the UK of the adult population is smoking. It's higher in, well, Greece at the moment. It's possibly going up, but it's higher also in Germany and in a number of countries where smoking is still a major cause of premature death. Not only through cardiovascular disease, through chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and also, of course, through lung cancer. Obesity has been mentioned already this morning. Obesity, by the way, is an immensely complex condition. There are strong genetic relationships in obesity. There are nations where the diet has changed dramatically in the course of a very short time. Around Arabia, around the Middle East, you will find that the nations whose diet was at one time simple cereals and fresh fish. It is now consuming all the mighty products of the mass American food manufacturers, is succumbing to obesity in a manner which can only be described as an epidemic. And with obesity, type 2 diabetes, the close correlation with that, which is a very serious disease in all societies. Alcohol is even increasing in popularity in a number of countries, although if you look at the OECD index, steadily alcohol consumption is falling in many countries. But alcohol abuse is costing the NHS in Britain something like £3 billion a year, and that's the direct cost of treating alcohol abuse, let alone the indirect costs on families and other models of support. The other thing we're starting to see is drug abuse, and particularly the higher concentration of cannabinoids in cannabis these days, often leading or having a strong correlation to schizophrenia in young people and mental disease and mental illness continuing throughout life. Another issue which we're really worried about is a behavioural one, which is a failure on the part of a patient to present with symptoms. Again, there's some relationship with ethnicity we find in the UK of some groups who are reluctant to talk to a general practitioner about a condition until, frankly, it's far too late to treat it. Some ethnic groups in relation to breast cancer, for example. And there are behavioural issues which defy the ability of modern doctoring to overcome the problem. I actually find it, I guess it's true here as well, that a general practitioner will commonly not see a healthy male between the age of 18 and 65. They just don't go to the doctor. I mean, women will because they've got the children and they go through obstetrics and gynecology, but males, particularly if they're drinking too much and eating too much, tend not to favour a visit to the doctor because they'll only get nagged, is the theory. So the consequence of, if you just think of the consequence of all of this, what have we done? We have invested heavily and brilliantly in dealing with acute conditions, and that will continue. It will be possible for us to survive longer and longer. Cancer, I forecast within the next 20 years, will become a chronic condition that we will live with. It will not be a fatal condition as it has been for so long. We understand far better what causes the cells to divide and multiply and what causes cancers and tumours to grow. We can understand better how to apply pharmaceutical interventions to hold it back, although at a price, and at an enormous price. And there are huge issues actually about the percentage of investment in healthcare that occurs in the last 2 years of people's lives, which is up to 80% of the total invested in healthcare over an individual's life. So I want to then turn to ask, well, what on earth can we do about all of this? We're going to have to reorient in all of our healthcare systems, we're already doing it, a lot of our resources away from the cathedrals of modern technology known as hospitals, into more of support in the community for a population that is living with multiple conditions, or as the physicians say, multiple comorbidities. That means, as my mother used to say, you're pretty crook. There's a lot going wrong all at once, but actually you can live with it. The quality of life may not be what it once was, but, well, whenever was it? What we need, though, I think, to understand is what do we do about it? Those changes are very difficult to bring about because actually they require an enormous amount of cultural change within those who provide healthcare. As David mentioned, I've been asked by the British government to chair the new NHS Commissioning Board. It's a part-time role, it's a chairman role, it's a non-executive role, but it's a fantastic opportunity to try to understand how we do start to invest more heavily in primary care and invest around those long-term conditions and around treating them in the community setting and no longer in hospitals, and to try to ensure that people who are vulnerable live lives that are as comfortable and as well cared for as possible. But we need to go further than that. Another area that I have to touch upon is dementia. As we age, so the incidence of dementia becomes the greater. 20% of the population over 80 have dementia in a clinical sense. And of course the proportion rises thereafter. These are hugely vulnerable people. And I saw some of the press coverage here at the weekend, and this position is no different in the UK. Vulnerable people often get badly treated, quite disgracefully badly treated. That vision of compassion, dignity and care that should characterise any humane health system sometimes just disappears. And who wants to live like that? So where do we turn, and what's the role of technology? What's the role of the fresh thinking we've been talking about this morning? Where can we intervene in ways that will make things happen? Let's just give you an example. Who ever asked me to be a bank teller? Who took away those banks where you would go in and there were people sitting behind glass things, often not behind glass things, and you went in, you had a long chat, and they sorted out your account and charged you for your overdraft? What do I do now? They've gone. Technology has completely, I think the Christchurch word is munted, the banks. I'm doing it myself. I sit at home. I don't go anywhere near a bank. I do it all on the computer. Who converted me into being a travel agent? What do I do? I want to go somewhere. I have to go to the computer, tap it in, give them my name, passport number, bank card. I choose where I go. I choose where I sit. Now I go to one of your airports, and it makes me print out the thing that goes on my luggage, put it on there, and throw it on a conveyor belt. Disruptive technology has transformed the fortunes of those companies. And if we're looking for a way of transforming healthcare, we need to find the Bill Gates. Where's Bill Gates for healthcare? Where's Mark Zuckerberg for healthcare? Are you here today? And if not, why not? We need to have a compelling vision of how we use modern technology to intervene, to reduce costs of healthcare, and to generate a healthcare system that's fit for purpose. There's an enormous amount going on. All healthcare systems tend to amass huge amounts of data and to make completely inadequate use of the data. I always think of the NHS in Britain. It has a unique database of over 60 million patients, and we don't use it. So we're data rich and intelligence poor. We need to find ways of using the data in several ways. How? Well, first of all, isn't the data the property of the patient? And shouldn't we be opening up the data so that every patient has access to their medical records and have generated in them a sense of control, not of dependence, but of an ability in co-discussions with medical professions to work out what is the best course. And I don't just mean about diagnostics. We invest an enormous amount in diagnostics. We don't invest an enormous amount in actually working out what patients want. And there's a very recent study which tries to correlate macro data of what patients say they want with micro outcomes, and the disparities are really very different. Secondly, only with data can we understand whether the system's working at all. How do we know whether we're improving the rates of recovery from cardiac surgery, for example? Only by data, only by using data. We used this in the UK to create a database which compared the performance of cardiac surgery units across the country. Every one of them knew they were world class until they saw the data. And then the data of outcomes showed that there were fantastic outcomes at the top, appalling outcomes, unsafe operating systems at the bottom. But over time, when everybody knew where they were on that list, so performance converged. And so the worst brought themselves up to the levels of the highest. We need to use data, thirdly, at the macro level to understand how, as a nation, we are developing our healthcare system and what interventions work and what interventions fail. But let me come back to the elderly and the frail and the vulnerable groups and those with dementia. What are we doing about houses? Why is it that my fridge won't talk to me? Why? Well, come on. I mean, a fridge is doing what a fridge has already done, which is keep stuff cold. But in the home of an elderly person, living on their own and wanting desperately to remain independent, when you open the fridge door, why shouldn't it just send a message to somebody to say, I'm alive, I've opened the fridge door. The fridge door hasn't been opened all night, but I've opened it this morning, I'm alive. Or inside is the medication. And here's the medication you take this morning, and it's organized electronically, it's organized using the machinery within the fridge, so that we might overcome a huge barrier to medication, which is in much of Europe, as much as a 65% non-compliance with prescribed medication. People taking the little blue pills home and putting them in a drawer and saying, I feel all right. We need to find ways of making not just fridges speak and fridges see and houses look and windows that have sensors. So if the window's been left open on a cold night, somebody knows. So that not only the vulnerable patient, but also the family can have some confidence that there's a system It doesn't require mum or dad to live with you, but it allows you to have a constant vigilance of the conditions under which they are living, the decisions that they're taking, and be alarmed to any change in their recognized behavior. How much do any of us look forward to old age? So what are we going to do about it? Age is no respecter of income, although it can make those final years more comfortable. My challenge is, and I think New Zealand is the place to find it, how do we smash through the old ways of doing things, the old cultures, use technology, but use, above all, ingenuity and innovation and intelligence to adapt an unsustainable healthcare system to the quite different needs of the 21st century. A lower tax base, a higher proportion of elderly people, a need to ensure that they are treated with proper dignity, respect and compassion. There are 3 reasons for suggesting that New Zealand can make a major contribution here. The first is that we're already quite a long way ahead. There's a very good paper published last month by Malcolm Pollock for the Health Information Technology Unit, and it's outstanding in describing what's happening and what the potential is and where New Zealand can sell ideas and products to the rest of the world. Secondly, this is a nation with a tradition not just of intellectual flexibility but also cultural adaptation and flexibility. There's a lot that can be done here that we just probably couldn't do readily in the UK or across Europe. I always find in a smaller country it's easier to break down some of the barriers and to do things differently and to think innovatively than in the larger countries. Thirdly, none of this requires a concentration of heavy manufacturing. The breakthroughs that you can make through using new media and IT and new light engineering are dramatic without the heavy industry that is essential for other things. Finally, New Zealand's got brains. They're all here. No, not all of them here this morning, but a very good cross-section of the New Zealand intelligence. Brains, resilience and capability. There's the challenge. Thank you.